I am, as Christy noted, the executive director of the Reeves Center. And in one sentence, I want to try to tell you what we do. William and Mary Reeves Center is named after a man whose name is Emery Reeves, who wrote a book called The Anatomy of Peace. So it makes sense to me that we are here today. At Reeves, global education, support for international students and scholars, and the promotion of international perspectives are at the heart of our work. Reeves' annual Tayloe Ross Lecture series and lecture is an important piece in the work of global engagement. Previous speakers include Ta-Nehisi Coates, Ryan Crocker, Tim Snyder, and today, Alissa Rubin. So now I will introduce Alissa. It's really an honor to be able to do this. I'll try to give her work and her person justice. Alissa Johansson Rubin is an international correspondent and senior writer for the New York Times, covering climate change and conflict in the Middle East. She joined the Times in January 2007 as a correspondent in Baghdad, covered Iraq and Afghanistan, becoming bureau chief in Baghdad in the fall of 2008. She moved to Afghanistan in October 2009, where she became bureau chief. She was in Kabul, Afghanistan for almost 4 years, leaving in 2013 to become Paris bureau chief. In Paris, she has continued to work on projects in Afghanistan and also joined the team covering the Islamic State's takeover of northern and western Iraq in 2014. I am just scratching the surface, I want you to know that, I'm sure you do. Her awards and recognitions are extensive. They include a 2016 Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting, the 2015 John Chancellor Award for Journalistic Achievement, a 2010 Overseas Press Association Award for a piece on women suicide bombers. She has been writing, this struck me as just so interesting, she has been writing and publishing since she was an undergraduate student at Brown University. She holds a bachelor's degree from Brown and an MA from Columbia. Among the many gifts Alissa brings to us today is a particularly skillful way of seeing the world. She brings a fearless approach to asking questions that should be obvious but aren't. And there is just something beautiful about the way she tells hard stories and about the way she helps us see and face the complexities of our world more clearly. Please join me in welcoming Alissa Rubin.
Thank you very, very much, Teresa, for that incredibly generous introduction. And I really want to thank everyone here at William and Mary Law School and at the Reeves Center for making this possible. It forces me, or it's forced me to step back and do some thinking and pull thoughts together, and journalists don't spend enough time on that. And especially, I'm grateful to Christy Warren, who leads the Center for Comparative Legal Studies and Post-Conflict Peace Building, as well as Teresa at the Reeves Center. And their team was incredibly supportive with numerous emails and answers to questions, Tyler Lawrence and Kate Hoving especially. So I hope what I have to say lives up to the very impressive list of past honorees, and it is daunting. I have to admit that when William and Mary invited me to speak on climate and conflict, I was pretty sure they'd made a mistake. They had somehow concluded that I actually knew something about climate and conflict. And what I really am is a journalist. And my skill is one that everyone in this room has and everyone watching this has, which is the ability to ask questions. I'm not a scientist, much less an expert on climate change. And while it's true that I've worked in war zones for much of the last 25 years, I've never shot a gun, I've never planned an assault, and I've never suffered the kinds of losses that every civilian suffers in war. So I asked myself, what could I offer you in a short talk? And to answer that question, I went for a long walk in a park near my home in Paris. Could you put up the first slide? It's a really beautiful place, and in spring and summer, the park is green, and right now the trees are coming into bud, and the daffodils are out, and the ducks are paddling on the small pond and brook that runs through it. And it's about as far from my working life in the Middle East and Central Asia as it's possible to imagine. And during that walk, I wondered how long the park would survive as I knew it. I wondered whether it would outlast climate change or fall victim to it. And if it fell victim, what would be left? What would it look like? Would the trees be uprooted by vandals? Would the duck pond be raided and the ducks taken for food? Would its daffodils and tulip bulbs never make it through the crusted earth? These kinds of thoughts had never occurred to me until about 3 years ago, when I returned to my job at the New York Times after a fellowship at Harvard. Without any clear mandate, my editors asked me what I wanted to do and what I wanted to cover. And the regions I knew best were the Middle East and Europe. And since there is never a shortage of journalists to cover Europe, I said I would go back to the Middle East and Central Asia. It turned out to be a fortuitous choice for looking at the future of climate and conflict. Scientists think the Middle East and North Africa is the most water-stressed region in the world, with 83% of the population facing scarcity, in part, although not, as we'll see entirely, because of climate change. If you could put up the water scarcity slide. So this shows you more or less in 2022 where there is really very already severe water scarcity, and it just will get worse in the coming decades. But it just gives you a sense of the starting point. But at that time, when I decided that, I hadn't quite realized what my focus would become. As I was returning to the Middle East, the places I knew best, Iraq, Syria, to some extent Iran, were relatively quiescent. The multiple wars that had strafed them were largely over. But all three were well into the second year of a drought. And when I had gone on a reporting trip to Iraq, I sensed precariousness, the kind of tension familiar to me before shooting starts or in the hiatus between bombs. So what was behind that tension? I had begun to hear stories of fights over wells, fights over how much water upstream villages were taking from downstream ones. And I was surprised by the intensity of the dust storms that year. They were longer, more frequent. They closed the Baghdad airport and made doing interviews outside impossible. I found myself thinking for the first time in years of the work of the mid-20th century French historian I had read in graduate school, Fernand Braudel. Trained as a geographer, he pioneered a new way of looking at the past. His was not a history of politics, of rulers, of territory won and lost. His was the history of place, of how mountains, lakes, deltas, and seas dictate how history plays out, how forces larger than men and women, although not entirely unaffected by them, determine much more than people realize. His landmark work, and the one which had riveted me, was a biography of the Mediterranean world in the 1500s, using as a starting point its geography and climate. He plumbed the data that existed on growing seasons and crop plantings, on pests and plagues. The more he delved in, the more he came to believe that without an understanding of those factors that man could not readily change, it was difficult to understand wars and empires, science and technology. It was the first time I had encountered a historian who asked questions like, if the Nile had not formed deltas, would Alexandria have been built there? If sea levels were lower, would Holland and Venice have become the great seafaring powers that they did? If a postman carrying a letter had not had to traverse the Swiss Alps, how much faster would news have traveled? There's a quote from the introduction to his work that distills what he has made me think about. The individual, he wrote, is imprisoned within a destiny in which he himself has little hand, fixed in a landscape in which the long term, the longue durée in French, stretches into the distance, both behind him and before him. In historical analysis, as I see it, he said, rightly or wrongly, the long run always wins in the end. As I reread his writing, I felt I had found the key to understanding what was happening now in the Middle East and beyond. Geography and climate were not just the stage on which events were unfolding. They were shaping the times, and I had paid little or no attention to them. So what did that mean for my work as a reporter? What was I not seeing? Was climate change a factor I had failed to consider as I reported on political tensions? What was the Middle East story of the longue durée? Until I had come back to Iraq in 2021, I worked primarily as a war reporter, not by choice, but because of one of those unforeseeable happenstances. I was posted overseas just months before September 11th, 2001, and the attacks in Washington and New York. So when they happened, I was at once, like so many people, horrified, but also baffled, and I asked to be part of covering the aftermath. So my subject became war. War happens fast. It's a great line of work if you are an adrenaline addict, and I am an adrenaline addict. It raises hard questions at every turn, but there's little time for grand thoughts because events keep happening. Even when I worked in Europe from 2014 to 2018, I was covering the European iteration of the so-called war on terror. But when I returned to the Middle East in 2021, much of that open warfare was over, yet the underlying tensions seemed, if anything, more pronounced. I felt I was watching a region holding its breath. But for what? The summer of 2021 was hot. Baghdad topped 120 degrees for several days at a time. The southern city of Basra was hotter, 123, 124. To the east, Iran's temperatures were on a par with Basra's, and Syria's were only marginally lower. Little happened between noon and 6 p.m. People who had to be outside scuttled between small pools of shade. I reported one night in a Basra hospital. In just an hour, 3 children were brought in various stages of diabetic shock. The dust storms came every week that spring. I counted 9 of them. But it wasn't until I talked to an elderly archaeology professor, Ali al-Hashimi, that something clicked. He told me that as a child, he used to go to Anbar province, an area of western Iraq that is often described as a desert. It's where Fallujah is located. And for those of you familiar with the US military, the Anbar Desert is the home of the Ain al-Assad Air Base. But when he went there with his relatives in the 1960s and 70s, he said, it was because it was so green. Green, I said. Oh yes, green, such orchards and fruits they had. We couldn't grow them in Baghdad. But it's a desert, Professor. Where were the orchards, I asked. Oh, he said, all along the Euphrates. There's less rain now, the summer comes earlier, it's hotter now. Some of the fruit trees were destroyed in the war, but others were neglected, not watered, they just died. And that conversation, more than any other, was when I recognized the land itself was changing. On one level, it didn't matter who controlled it. Al-Qaeda, Saddam's troops, the new Iraqi government. Their actions would be determined, not entirely, but in some considerable measure by something larger than politics. When I went to visit even the small US troop contingent out at Ain al-Assad, they could not launch drones on nights with sandstorms or dust storms, as sophisticated as that technology has become. Weather mattered. When I heard about fights among villages or between clans or between the police and locals, I would dig into the reasons, and I found increasingly water access was a factor. Sometimes the fights were barroom brawls, lots of shouting and fist shaking. But other times people came to blows or shots were fired. In 2021, a fight between villages over water left 10 people dead. Was there really less water? Why? Was it hotter? Was climate change to blame? Statistics, as I looked into them, told a complex story. One of the challenges for everyone here who thinks about climate change is acknowledging how much we are still learning and how seemingly contradictory climate events such as drought and downpours, can exist simultaneously, and in fact are becoming more frequent and longer in duration. Exact increases in rising temperature and exact reductions in rainfall are much disputed. There are many ways to calculate them. There are not exactly direct trend lines up or down. But what is not in doubt is that the Middle East and North Africa is warming faster than the rest of the world, at least 20% faster according to the United Nations, and according to a peer-reviewed 2022 study, twice as fast as the rest of the world. At the same time, rainfall is declining, not as dramatically as the warming trend, but warmer temperatures accelerate evaporation, so it can feel that way. These trends will continue to accelerate for years, even if the world manages to rein in greenhouse gas production. So in many ways, this region, the region where I was working, is a window on the future for the rest of the world. We need to pay attention to it, because what it is suffering now, other places will suffer soon. And to the extent that the region can find solutions, other parts of the world can benefit from them. So maybe you can put up the slide of heat to the next one. So that's a slide that is actually part of a graphic in a piece we did on heat at the New York Times, and that's 2015 and areas of extreme heat. And if you were to go to the article, it would take you forward up through about 2035, and you would see how those areas spread out across the globe, and whether where you live might be included in it, or where you visit. So it's a starting point that's quite chilling, although it's very hot. For me, as a journalist on the ground, seeing the reality of these extremes really can't be overstated. In Iraq, in Uzbekistan, in Iran, lakes are disappearing altogether and becoming mudflats. Too little water means farmers cannot grow the crops to feed their animals, nor water them in seasonal streams. I visited a farmer I had gotten to know who lived near the Iranian border. He had taken all his cows to be slaughtered except one heifer and her calf, and he considered himself lucky. Other farmers who lived nearby, who had too little water, had let their animals go, and we saw cows wandering along the roads, others dead, their carcasses bloated, rotting in the sun, attended only by flies and vultures. None of this is completely new. Drought has happened before in this region, but what has changed is the frequency and the duration, the certainty of extreme heat every year. And for those whose livelihood is linked to the land, that means they're poorer, they have lower incomes all round, and for many, they have to gradually move towards cities. But the cities have little to offer rural people. The farmer who had been able to keep the cow explained that he hadn't stayed in school past 3rd grade. What can I do in the city, he asked. And the cities lack water and sanitation. So was this the latest iteration of Fernand Braudel's longue durée, the gradual rendering of whole regions too dry and too hot, or too hot and too humid for the flourishing of human life? Still, as a reporter, I had to ask myself that perhaps I was seeing too local a problem and making too much of just what was around me that I could report on. But as I looked across the literature, it wasn't just Iraq and Syria. In Iran, riots broke out over water shortages in Sistan and Baluchistan province in the east of the country. There were skirmishes in Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya. In southern India and Pakistan, violence erupted over water scarcity. Most disputes were within countries, but some traversed international borders. In 2021, Iraq threatened to take Iran to the International Court of Justice for diverting tributaries to the Tigris River to ensure that the water stayed inside Iran's borders. Diverting rivers? Really? Could that be true? I asked. I found engineers who showed me photos. They had worked on the construction. Iran had built tunnels that moved the water so that it did not cross the border. If a country is desperate for water, they will do anything, even change the course of a river. In West Africa, my colleagues were reporting on cattlemen and fishermen in Niger, Chad, and Cameroon who were fighting so violently over water access that tens of thousands of people fled, and many were I think about 40 were killed. Let's put up maybe the next one, yeah. Was climate change to blame? This is a map that RAND just put out. They're doing a study on sort of to show where the CENTCOM, which is the area that covers the Middle East through Central Asia, is likely to see more conflict in the coming years. And it's a very interesting map because, like climate change, it's not constant. It doesn't show some vast reddening across the whole region, but it shows how much it's going to hit all these different places that are under stress. So was climate change to blame for all of these conflicts? That's the question that's now the center of my reporting work. It would be a mistake to suggest they're simple answers, but it would be a mistake too to ignore that the changing climate plays a role in a deepening instability and vulnerability in the face of extreme weather. Governments and aid organizations, the United Nations among them, as you'll hear later, now routinely includes climate experts when they go into areas of conflict. The Pentagon has begun to factor dealing with the changing climate into every aspect of its warfare, from the clothes troops wear, to the weapons they use, to the kinds of scenarios they are preparing for. The climate has become as hostile a force as an enemy army. It has become one of Fernand Braudel's immutables, a reality that is shaping how events unfold. But does that mean there's more likelihood of conflict? Where does that fit? In my first 2 years of reporting on this, I came to some unexpected realizations, not least of all that my initial assumption that climate change was a cause of conflict was a vast oversimplification. Yes, the climate was changing in ways that made parts of the world where I worked hotter and drier, and also in some cases more humid. Yes, that made people sicker, less productive, and poorer. But did that mean they would take up arms? The answer I've come to so far, may change, is that it depends. Some of the countries most affected by climate change in the Middle East are almost unimaginably wealthy. And those countries will experience climate change very differently from their more impoverished neighbors. In the oil-rich Persian Gulf states of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar, places with relatively small populations and immense wealth, they will be able to buy themselves out of some of the worst outcomes of climate change. Those governments are building multiple billion-dollar desalination plants to make fresh water out of seawater. They have launched cloud seeding programs to force small percentages of more rainfall from the sky. And some of them are buying or leasing fertile land in other countries where they hope to grow their food. What that means for the people in those places is worrying indeed. The United Arab Emirates is leasing swaths of farmland in Angola and South Sudan. Saudi Arabia is working on investments in Egypt and Ethiopia. Qatar has leased land in Kenya. However, other Middle Eastern and North African countries are too poor to buy themselves guaranteed food sources, and they lack the governance capability, at least right now, to institute conservation. In those places, armed local disputes over water access are already happening. A well between two villages or a lock on an irrigation canal is contested ground. People destroy dams. They block water going to one village so that it will go to another. Writ large, that competition is happening between countries. Although states have not yet, and perhaps won't, start shooting wars, upstream countries are grabbing water with the ruthlessness of combatants looking to seize the advantage. In East Africa, which my very esteemed colleagues know much better than I, the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia limits the flow of the Blue Nile into Sudan and Egypt. Egypt is a country of 104 million Egyptians who rely on the Nile, many of them rely, most of them, on the Nile for water and their livelihood. There are millions more people in Sudan. Turkey has built more than 23 dams on the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, cutting the water flows into Syria and Iraq. There are dams and river diversions on the Sirdarya and Amudarya River in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, which have shrunk the Aral Sea, which was once the 4th largest lake in the world, to the point that there's hardly water left in it, decimating the prolific Uzbek fishing industry. However, is that the fault of climate change, or is climate change the condition that magnifies these underlying problems? As I looked at different places and situations, I concluded it was often the latter. Climate change has magnified the implications of rising demand for water worldwide and the lack of a way to adjudicate disagreements over water, which is a finite and life-giving resource. Certainly, in the best of all possible worlds, all countries would come together and take all the steps necessary to stem the emission of greenhouse gases, and gradually the rising temperatures and increasingly erratic weather would stabilize. But even if they did that, it wouldn't solve the problem immediately. And the reality is that that shows no likelihood of happening. So what's the way forward? I don't have answers, but here are the areas which contribute to increasing misery and increasing likelihood of conflict in many of the poorest, hottest, and driest parts of the world. If people worked on these, perhaps they could help ameliorate some of the worst impacts of climate change in those places. First of all, we have no enforceable system of sharing the rivers, lakes, and aquifers that span more than one country. 60% of rivers cross national boundaries. Even more countries share aquifers with their neighbors. The reality of what happens is that the country that is upstream wins the water sweepstakes. It can take as much water for itself as it wants, leaving the downstream country to make do. There is a United Nations Convention on Transboundary Waters. About 30 to 35% of UN countries have signed it. And those that have, not surprisingly, are downstream countries, the ones that would benefit from it. Thus, for example, Iraq has signed the UN Convention, but Turkey, which is taking more than its share of the Euphrates River, has not. Similarly, Uzbekistan has signed it, but Tajikistan has not. The flows on the Euphrates are down about 45% in Iraq. A small amount of that is due to climate change. The majority is the result of upstream dams. The same is true, as I mentioned, in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. There are different outcomes, but similar situations on the Mekong, where China is building immense dams which have enormous implications for fishing and life in Cambodia and Vietnam. So that is one huge area which needs work. A second problem is poor governance. Governments have tremendous power to regulate water use. In Iraq and Syria, in Afghanistan and Iran, governments can intervene to stop one village from taking more than its share. They can regulate what water is used for. For instance, in Iraq, rice was still grown until 2023, even though there was insufficient water. In Turkey, the government has helped to create a cotton industry just in the last 40 to 50 years, despite it being a water-intensive crop. Russia just announced it would invest in cotton cultivation in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, even though there's too little water there. There has been a vast, and to me incomprehensible, expansion in fish farming throughout the Middle East. It's a place with too little fresh water and high temperatures, therefore fish farms have an enormous amount evaporates, and fish farming needs to be regulated. But in Iraq, where the industry has exploded, the business is protected or controlled by militias. The government can't seem to stop them. So there are 250,000 legal fish farms and 900,000 illegal ones. Last year, when the Water Ministry's police tried to close down a handful of the illegal ones, they were shot at and run out of town. The third problem is one entangled with the second across much of the Middle East. Irrigation methods have seen few changes since Sumerian times, 6,000 years ago. The practice then, and it worked very well at that time, was to flood the fields in spring and sometimes a second, even a third time for later planting. But today, with water in short supply, flooding fields means losing between 65 to 70% of water to runoff and evaporation. There's just too little water to use such methods. Governments could mandate and subsidize drip irrigation and follow through on making it happen. Farmers don't want to invest unless they know their neighbors will do it too. They fear losing the advantage. The fourth issue, and probably the most sensitive, is population growth. In much of North Africa and the Middle East, for centuries, populations were able to survive on the water from underground aquifers, rivers, and rainfall. But in just the last 50 to 60 years, one of the greatest changes has been an explosion in the population of previously sparsely populated areas, and at the same time, development that has created demand for more water than these very arid regions could provide. The same is true across the Middle East and North Africa, stretching into Pakistan and Afghanistan. Demand is rising as supply shrinks. The average annual population growth in the Middle East, North Africa region is 2.1%, which doesn't really help you because some areas are growing much faster and some not. But overall, it's a very rapid rate of growth given the natural capabilities of what the region can support. In the UAE, and many people here may have been through Dubai at some point, in 1960, there were about 110,000 people in the whole country. Today, there are nearly 10 million. And there's less water because the aquifers have been depleted. So given all this, what lies ahead? I am not sanguine. I do not believe that people will change fast enough to avoid widespread suffering for the poorest people, and especially those who live in the harshest places. Can we put up that last slide? This is a dust storm from about a year ago that I took a picture of in Baghdad. One of the people in this field I most look up to, David Wallace Wells, whose book, The Uninhabitable Earth, ought to be required reading for everyone, starts off by saying, "It is much, much worse than you think." Yes, I think he's right. I wish more people could see it. I went to visit one of the very few environmental scientists in Iraq. He teaches at Basra University. And I asked him what he thought would happen in Iraq and Syria, the once fertile crescent, in the coming decades. He said, well, there will be more pandemics, more people will get sick, they will die younger, they will suffer more, but don't quote me on that. Will conflicts arise related to water shortages or related to climate migrants? Will environmental activists turn to violence? Yes, I think they will. The conflicts will not be caused by climate change alone, but it will be a factor because of all the other failings: poor governance, insufficient international rules of the road, an outdated approach to farming and energy use. But my hope, and the reason I will keep trying to write about it, is that once you see the seriousness of the problem, it's impossible to unsee it. And maybe if more and more people see it, it will be possible to make the changes that are needed. Today, you will hear from lawyers and diplomats, development experts and scientists who are each doing something to make a difference. To me, they are unsung heroes. They are working in places where change comes slowly. Resistance is constant, but they've kept going. And I hope other people will join them, because this is all we have. This earth, this sky, these rivers, these oceans. Thank you very much.